Last week, after I spoke with New York Times tech columnist Kevin Roose about the alarming speed at which AI is advancing, I found myself thinking about another conversation we had on this show. This one was with philosopher David Chalmers, who rose to prominence in the 1990s when he started writing about what he called the hard problem of consciousness.
How and why is it that physical processes in the brain should give you a conscious experience at all?
We still don't have a definitive answer, but our search for one feels more pressing than ever because in what feels like just the last few weeks, we've entered a new era, the age of AI, where computers are rapidly improving their ability to learn and communicate. It makes you wonder if hooking up 86 billion neurons in the right pattern gives us the experience of consciousness, could you achieve something similar with lines of code? In other words, could AI one day be sentient? David and I had a long conversation about this, big chunks of which ended up on the cutting room floor by the time my exacting producer, Caleb, was done with it. So today we're sharing the unedited version of my interview with David.
LinkedIn presents.
The main slogan in this book, Reality Plus, is virtual reality is genuine reality.
I'm Rufus Griscom, and this is The Next Big Idea. Today, are we living in a simulation? Philosopher David Chalmers says there's a decent chance that we are, but he's okay with it. Let's begin with a clip from a classic American movie, The Matrix. The film, if you're one of the 17 people on Earth who hasn't seen it, revolves around a character named Neo, played by Keanu Reeves. He lives an ordinary life until he meets Morpheus, played by Lawrence Fishburne, who lets him in on a secret.
Right now, we're inside a computer program.
Is it really so hard to believe? Your appearance now is what we call residual self-image. It is the mental projection of your digital self.
This isn't real.
What is real? How do you define real? If you're talking about what you can feel, what you can smell, what you can taste and see, then real is simply electrical signals interpreted by your brain. This is the world that you know. The world as it was at the end of the 20th century. It exists now only as part of a neural interactive simulation that we call the Matrix.
No. I don't believe it. It's not possible.
I didn't say it would be easy, Neo. I just said it would be the truth.
Stop! Let me out! Let me out! I want out!
I've always sympathized with Neo in that scene. I think most people do. If someone told you that your life is a lie, that the world you live in is a simulation, that what you perceive is not reality, well, you'd be pretty upset too. But when philosopher David Chalmers first saw the film, he had a totally different reaction. A brain in a vat, he wrote in response to the movie, is not massively diluted, at least if it has always been in a vat. Neo does not have massively false beliefs about the external world. And here's the kicker. Dave says, even if I am in a matrix, my world is perfectly real. In the 20 plus years since The Matrix came out, Dave has continued to stew over the questions it first stirred in him. In his new book, Reality Plus, Virtual Worlds and the Problems of Philosophy, he shares his conclusions. Virtual worlds, he writes, are not illusions or fictions. Virtual reality is genuine reality. This bold statement, which I should say is backed up by rigorous philosophical thinking, has caused quite a stir. But then, that's what David Chalmers does. He made a name for himself back in the mid-1990s for giving a name to one of science's most vexing questions. How do the brain's physical processes produce subjective experiences? Dave dubbed it the hard problem of consciousness, and he's been busy trying to solve it as co-director of the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness at NYU. That's his day job. In his spare time, Dave is part of a cadre of philosophers who are pioneering techno-philosophy, daring not only to ask philosophical questions about technology, like, is it possible to live a good life in virtual reality, but also to use technology to reanimate long-standing philosophical debates. If philosophy sounds old-fashioned to you, then you haven't spent time with David Chalmers. because in his hands, the discipline is as modern, lively, and relevant as ever. In the book, Dave posits that within a century, we will have virtual realities that are indistinguishable from the non-virtual world. If we want to retain a sense of meaning and purpose and humanity as we make this transition, if we want these worlds and the one we leave behind to be vibrant and equitable, then we need to start thinking about it now.
Hi, I'm Kwame Christian, CEO of the American Negotiation Institute, and I have a quick question for you. When was the last time you had a difficult conversation? These conversations happen all the time, and that's exactly why you should listen to Negotiate Anything, the #1 negotiation podcast in the world. We produce episodes every single day to help you lead, persuade, and resolve conflicts both at work and at home. So level up your negotiation skills by making Negotiate Anything part of your daily routine.
David Chalmers, welcome to the Next Big Idea podcast.
Thanks, Rufus. It's great to be here.
Dave, you are a philosopher. I'm sure over the course of your career, you've had to explain to a few people, maybe your parents at some point, what exactly it means to be a philosopher in 2022. To some people, it has an old-fashioned sound to it, right? You have alchemists, philosophers, sorcerers. And maybe that's because most of the philosophers we think of are people who lived a long time ago, Socrates, Plato, Kierkegaard, and so on. But in the last couple decades, the work that you have done, and Nick Bostrom and others, has, I think, brought philosophy back to the center of some of the most important conversations we're having about our future as a species. Do you have the sense that philosophy is reascendant right now?
There's a long tradition of philosophers being very central in science and technology. I mean, Isaac Newton actually thought of himself as a philosopher. He was professor of natural philosophy, and then he did his work on physics and managed to build enough of a theory of it that we ended up spinning off the science of physics, basically span out of philosophy. And this has happened again and again. Psychology got started from philosophy, and then they figured out how to do some experiments and made science of it. So I think philosophy is, for a very long time been central in the sciences, and in furthermore thinking about technology. Boy, you can get Plato worrying about the new technology of writing back in his dialogues more than 2,000 years ago. But maybe you're right that there was a period in the mid-20th century where philosophy retreated a bit into just thinking about language and thinking about words and thinking about some very abstract issues. I think that was important work. I don't want to denigrate it, but I think you're right that right now the onrush of technology, I think, has given a real special role for there are issues here that just need philosophical reflection. The advances in artificial intelligence, oncoming virtual reality technology, the internet, social media. I think they all raise so many issues, and I think that suddenly, philosophers are moving back to the front and center here.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think the possibilities of technology have become increasingly awesome in both senses of the word. I mean, amazing and frightening, and science has gotten weirder, right? Physics is getting very strange and discomforting, I think, to some people. And I think philosophy is a sort of useful tool in reorienting our questions in a more human-centric way, right? To say, what does this mean for us? What does this say about us? How can we navigate this increasingly kind of strange and amazing world?
One nice thing about being a philosopher also is you get to take the big picture perspective. A neuroscientist will think especially about neuroscience, and a physicist will think especially about physics. But as a technologist will think especially about technology. But as a philosopher, we kind of get to put the pieces together. So I think about, okay, what is the science saying about this? What is the technology saying about this? What is literature saying about this? What is the arts saying about this? And we kind of get to take that big picture perspective, which actually for me was the biggest reason I went into philosophy in the first place. I was interested in the mind, and I could have been working in say, artificial intelligence or psychology. But I thought, yeah, they're going to get a piece of the pie. I'll get a slice of the pie that way. But to approach it in the big picture way, philosophy is perfect for that.
And I think that you may have coined a new word, techno-philosophy, right? This idea of a two-way interaction between technology and philosophy. How do you think about that?
Yeah, here I was actually inspired by the philosopher of neuroscience, Patricia Churchland, who used to talk about, and still does talk about, neurophilosophy, which is a two-way interaction between neuroscience and philosophy. Philosophically, we think about issues in neuroscience, but also we use neuroscience to shed light on some of the big traditional issues in philosophy. What's the relationship between the mind and the body? How do we know anything about the world? So techno-philosophy does the same thing for technology. We think philosophically about technology like artificial intelligence. What does that mean? Could an AI system be conscious? What kind of rights might they have? Or virtual reality. Could we actually live a meaningful life in a virtual world? That's thinking philosophically about technology. But at the same time, I think thinking about technology can shed light on some of the big traditional questions of philosophy. How do we know anything about the external world? We start thinking about the possibility of living in a virtual reality, and if we were in a virtual reality, would we know anything about the external world? I think actually technology brings new light to bear on many of these big traditional issues. So technology, techno-philosophy, as you say, is that two-way interaction.
So interesting. Well, this new book of yours, Reality Plus, Virtual Worlds and the Problems of Philosophy, is a head spinner. I've had a huge amount of fun just in the last few weeks sharing some of your perspectives and claims with friends and acquaintances. I'm just rubbing my hands together over here, thinking about sort of the sequencing. I thought it might make sense to begin with your least outlandish head spinning assertions and gradually work our way to your most absurd ideas. Or not absurd in the sense of, I actually think they're all totally compelling, as you'll hear. This way, listeners may be able to go the full distance with us. Does it sound logical?
Great strategy. If it works, I might have to adopt it myself.
Okay. Let's start with your theory of the extended mind. Our regular listeners will have some exposure to this because we had Annie Murphy-Paul on the show, who, as you know, she wrote a book, as you know, called The Extended Mind. That was based on a paper that you published in 1998 with Andy Clark. Do you want to share the extended mind theory?
Yeah, the key idea in the theory of the extended mind is that the tools we use can actually become parts of our mind. The paradigm example, I guess, is a smartphone. Which you might think of as a useful assistant to help us get things done, to help us make plans and make decisions. But back in the 90s, Andy Clark and I argued that these tools can actually become part of the thinking process themselves, roughly as extensions of the brain. Actually, back then, our example wasn't a smartphone. We didn't have smartphones yet in 1995 when we wrote the paper. Our central example was just a notebook. Somebody who writes something down in a notebook and uses that as a sort of memory. Maybe you store things in your biological memory, but actually we talked about an Alzheimer's patient who needs to go to the Museum of Modern Art, checks his notebook and it says, okay, the museum is on 53rd Street, and sets out to the museum. And we contrasted that with the case of someone who does this all with the biological memory. And we wanted to say, actually, in this case, the notebook is literally part of your memory. It's playing exactly the same role as a biological memory. Back then, we put forward this thesis. A lot of people thought, come on, this is out there. This is speculative. This is a little bit crazy. I mean, we did have the internet then, and we did use the internet as an example. But interestingly, over the next 10 or 20 years, this thesis has, I think, come to seem to many people to be now totally obvious because of the roles that technology is playing in our lives. We all have a smartphone that does so much of the work of our memory for us. No one bothers to remember a phone number with their brain anymore. It's all in the smartphone. It'll do navigation for us with mapping software. It'll help do some planning for us with calendar software. So yeah, this technology is basically becoming an extension of our minds. And I don't know, to me, that just rings true. If someone takes away my my smartphone, I feel kind of helpless, as if I've been mentally disabled.
Well,
a little bit.
Ned Block made this wonderful comment that your theory was not true in 1998 when you published the paper, but it has since become true. and as you say, I think most everyone listening can relate with this notion that if you take away our smartphones, we all become bumbling idiots, right? We no longer know each other's phone numbers. We don't know how to navigate. We're quite literally offloading parts of our brains onto these devices, and we feel that when we misplace them, which some of us do more frequently than others. Thank goodness I have a watch that causes my phone to make noise. But
it's just going to catch on even more once in the future. Yeah, we've got so much wearable computing. We've got watches. We've got phones. Pretty soon, we're going to have glasses that present information to us just in the middle of our visual field.
Exactly. So it strikes me there are two ways of looking at this. We can either conclude that our phones are turning us into idiots, or there are better things we can do with our brains than store phone numbers or navigate. Right? That maybe we can offload. We can empower our brains to do more interesting things by leaning on these devices. I love this detail that you mentioned, that Socrates thought that books were making us stupid. And then there's this lovely irony that we only know this about Socrates because Plato wrote it down.
Right. Yeah, the ancient Greeks were very dubious about this whole writing thing. There was a tradition of remembering an oral tradition. You'd tell stories from pass them down from one generation to the next, and people would remember these stories, and this was regarded as a very important skill. And then this thing, writing, came along. You could just record this stuff automatically so that anyone could access it. And yeah, Socrates was saying, come on, this is not genuine memory anymore. This is just rote recollection or something. It's not the same. People are going to be are no longer going to have the capacity for genuine memory in the future. But of course, what we find is that writing has basically just extended our mind. It's made us so much more capable by building on what other people have written down. Mm-hmm. It's given us enormous memory capacities, and arguably writing is responsible for an awful lot of what's happened in advanced human civilization. So I think, the potential is that extended mind technology could do something very similar. I'd like to think that it could, by encoding so much automatically in our devices, giving us access to so much more information and so much more directly, that leaves more room for us to do the creative part, the conscious part. We're still conscious beings at the center of all this, and we still ultimately, make decisions about what to do. But by offloading so much of the informational drudge work to technology, I think this has got the potential to just open us up to new possibilities. It's also got the potential for that mind extension to harm us. If we lose the, it's also got the potential for there to be dangers in this mind extension process. If you lose your smartphone, then you're suddenly a lot less capable. Furthermore, if it turns out that, say, the tech companies or the Facebook algorithm are controlling your what you see on your smartphone, then there are going to be dangers there as well. So, like every technology, I think it's got upsides and downsides, but I think the potential is enormous.
And as you say, we're on the verge of some pretty extraordinary advances in augmented reality technology. I mean, right now we have Apple's rumored to be releasing augmented reality glasses this fall. And by the way, I think most people know that this would be an experience of navigating the world where you have an overlay of additional data and information. So it's sort of part virtual, part physical. Apple's rumored to have thousands of people working on this. Microsoft has their HoloLens technology. They just closed a $22 million deal to deliver 120,000 HoloLens kits to the US military. Google has Project Iris, forecasting a 2024 release. So we're talking about, like, if rumors are to be believed, the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, we could see several kind of mass market augmented reality systems coming forward. And we all know that the last 15 years, that the iPhone's only been out for 15 years, we've seen how dramatically that has changed our behavior and experience of the world. And so this 15 years from now, we could look back and say, wow, we had, just like we talk about pre-iPhone days, we could talk about pre-augmented reality days. How do you think this technology is likely to change our experience?
Yeah, I do think it's very likely that augmented reality could end up being the next big computing platform. It's just got so much potential. Once the technology is developed far enough, it's just got so much potential. For a start, it could replace all of our screen-based computing in principle. I mean, right now we do all this stuff with screens on our smartphones or our desktop computers, but once you've got a good enough set of augmented reality glasses, it can project screens into the world in front of you whenever you need them, giant screens if necessary, on which you can do all your computing, and then they can just go away when you don't need them. So in principle, augmented reality could replace all those screens, and then just the abilities it would have in, like, enabling all kinds of information and interaction. Mark Zuckerberg was giving a talk the other day, because I guess Meta or Facebook is also very heavily invested in augmented reality technology, but then was thinking about it in the context of language translation, automatic language translation for all the languages of the world. You go somewhere, someone starts speaking in some other language, and it gets just immediately translated for you as they speak, maybe in a visual form, so you read it through your glasses, or maybe it's directly spoken to you in English or whatever your language is. Just think how incredibly useful that could be. Recognizing people, likewise. Maybe you walk into a room and it's going to show you people's names, at least if they've enabled that capacity.
Dave, this is a fantasy of mine. This will really be helpful for me, because I, as a parent of a few kids, walking into the parent nights, and there's so many people and they all have different children, and I have to, have a little trouble with that. And the idea that my augmented reality glasses will just pop up over their heads, their names, the ages of their children. They came, we went to their birthday party last year. That'll be a great help.
I totally need this as I get older. I'm counting on the technology to develop and extend my mind faster than my biological mind shrinks.
Absolutely. Well, I'll tell you, another use case that I'm really looking forward to that you actually cite in the book is the opportunity to walk around ancient ruins and see a full 3D display of, say, ancient Rome rising up from the remaining stones in the ground. I had the great pleasure last summer of visiting the island of Delos in Greece. I don't know if you've ever been there. Just stunning ancient ruins. And I was just itching for a pair of AR glasses that would fully render the sort of the ancient glory of Delos.
Yeah, in the book we have an illustration of the Academy in Athens, Plato's Academy, and there you actually get to see Plato and Aristotle walking through the Academy, which, in fact, in the present day Athens is just a ruin. There's a few bits of stone on the ground there, but yeah, with augmented reality glasses, we can rebuild the Academy, and you can see Plato and Aristotle walking through. So yeah, that's kind of transporting you to using this technology to transport you to new worlds. In a way, this augmented reality glasses, in principle, they extend the mind, along the lines we were talking about before. They enable us to recognize people better. They can enable us to understand language better. They may enable us to navigate better. But they also extend the world. They put new things into the world. When you get the Academy of Athens there in the world, it's okay. It's transforming us into a new world. This is so literally augmented reality. There's a world there which is now which is now augmented by the addition, say, of Plato's Academy to the world. So we're augmenting both our minds and the world.
And as you say, we can imagine this having both incredibly empowering impacts on our daily experience and the way that we use our brains, and also potentially concerning ones. Like one thing that struck me is, I'm sure you've heard of the studies of the brains of London taxi drivers that show that they have larger hippocampi, the part of the brain that navigates spatial intelligence. Because they're using their internal mapping systems more intensively than the rest of us, so they're actually growing that part of their brain. We've also read about blind people who use part of the visual cortex for other purposes to actually like enhance their ability to hear and smell, right? So if we find that all of a sudden, name recognition and, language processing and whatever, there's any number of and navigation is provided for us, there's an argument that we could begin to use parts of our brain that we used to use, right, for really kind of basic rudimentary stuff for new purposes, which would mean that without these glasses, we would truly become helpless.
Yeah, there's a nice scene in the science fiction novel Accelerando by Charles Stross, where they basically rely on amazing glasses to do everything for them. Everyone carries around these spectacles that extend their mind. They call it a exocortex, and so much of their lives are carried on in their specs. And then at one point, the main character's specs get stolen, and he's reduced to a gibbering wreck. It's like, oh my God, what's going on here? How can I do anything? And until he gets the specs back, it's just a total disaster. I mean, I guess this is the case for almost any technology. Once bikes come along or cars, and we can get around a whole lot better. But then once we don't have the car, it's like, okay, people are no longer as good at walking or running or whatever as they were. So I guess we have to count on the technology still being there in the future. Normally, technologies don't go away. Of course, if there was massive nuclear disaster and the internet went down, then we'd all be in a whole lot of trouble.
Well, I'm sure there'll always be some people like barefoot runners or my father with his flip phone who will be holdouts and will resist. We can count on them, and it won't become entirely reliant upon them if the system shuts down. Well, so let's move on to virtual worlds, moving to sort of further into the future, arguably, and to more powerful and immersive technologies. When we think of virtual worlds, I think of them as sort of different degrees of immersion, right? I mean, we're seeing the beginning of VR headsets that are pretty fully immersive. I can also think of video games. When I look at the behavior of my children, if I walk by their rooms when they're playing games with their friends, and I hear squeals and shrieks and yips and yowls. I mean, they are having a lot of fun in a high adrenaline, play state. It's not full immersion, right? Because they're just looking at big screens. Do you think of that as kind of a first step into virtual worlds?
Yeah, I think they're actually kind of continuous in some ways. I distinguish virtual worlds from virtual reality. And a virtual world, you're already in a virtual world when you play a video game on a desktop. For me, a virtual world just has to be a computer-generated world which is interactive, that you can interact with. So when a kid is playing around in Minecraft or Fortnite or Roblox, then they're already in a virtual world. Virtual reality adds the extra condition of immersiveness, that you have an immersive, interactive, computer-generated world. And that's where, say, something like a virtual reality headset comes in. You put on one of these headsets and you're immersed in a world all around you, a three-dimensional world with your perspective at the center. So there's virtual worlds in both cases. Once it's immersive, I guess it just becomes all the more real and all the more continuous with physical reality. But that said, right now there's way more people using, say, video games on a desktop than there are using headsets. So right now, the dominant way to experience virtual worlds is non-immersively. Possibly in the future, that could change. And we'll all start experiencing these worlds immersively.
Well, if my children are any indication, some people are already choosing virtual worlds over reality if they're given the liberty to do so. But yeah, it's we have an Oculus 2 at home, and I not long ago I was playing the ping pong game on the new Oculus system, which is I love table tennis, and it's remarkably accurate as to the physics of playing ping pong. And
I just played mini golf for the first time yesterday, and it was the same. It was
really?
It was exactly like playing mini golf. The ball bounced around in a totally plausible way. The physics engines are getting pretty good.
That's extraordinary. I love mini golf, but at the end of this game of ping pong, I just instinctively, drop put the paddle on the surface of the table and let it go. And of course, it fell 3 feet, and I might have damaged the.
I hope it's okay.
The equipment. It was fine, but clearly, like it is already compelling enough as an immersive experience that I'm actually like, I believe that I in that moment I believe the table was there, and this is just the beginning. And there's a lot that's missing, right? There's this sense of kind of the weight of objects that we interact with, and a lot of like haptic feedback. There's a whole lot of technology that will be necessary to actually fully cause us to believe that we're inhabiting this world. Is it your view that it's just a matter of time? How long do you think that'll take?
I think it's gradually going to get there. I mean, there's plenty of short-term obstacles, not least that, people still get certain amounts of, motion sickness if they stay in VR too long. I find I'll often stay in there for maybe half an hour or an hour at a time, but, I'll spend 12 hours sitting staring at my desktop computer doing stuff on the internet. And so far, that's not happening for VR, but that'll get better with the technology. I think the body is the biggest limitation for now. I mean, it's getting pretty good at vision and hearing, but actually, touch, you don't get much of a sense of touch in VR. Yeah. You don't have that much of a sense of your own body. I mean, if you actually move the physical body, then you can get a sense of moving your body around in VR as well. But, touch is much more difficult, let alone things like eating or drinking or sex. There are not really adequate versions of those things in VR. So I do think that's a long-term problem. But over time, maybe we'll, for example, develop brain-computer interfaces where VR devices start interfacing directly with the brain rather than having to go through the sensory organs. And maybe for things like the bodily sensors and touch and so on will be much more realistic that way. It could even be that, eating, or maybe it could stimulate the taste areas. So you eat a nutritious but tasteless blob in physical reality, and your brain will be stimulated in such a way that you'll have the best meal you ever had, as far as it tastes like, in virtual reality.
Well, this would be if I could feed my kids kale and they'd believe it was a Rice Krispie treat. That I think would be progress.
Fantastic.
But
people are already doing it now. By the way, you can go to a restaurant. Occasionally, go to a restaurant and just put on a headset that makes the food look totally amazing and otherworldly. Huh. So it actually, it tastes more or less the same, but actually having this new appearance inside the virtual reality headset, for some people, it's like, oh my God, that transformed my whole experience of eating this meal.
Well, now we're coming up to some of the kind of bold assertions you make in the book, which is you say that virtual worlds, which are likely to become more and more compelling and immersive, such that we eventually will choose to spend sustained periods of time there, that virtual worlds are real and that you can live a good life there, maybe even a better life. Is that accurate?
Yeah. The main slogan in this book, Reality Plus, is virtual reality is genuine reality. So, there's a long tradition of thinking in these virtual worlds, these virtual realities are just kind of second-class realities. They're illusions, they're hallucinations, they're fictions. But I think that doesn't really do justice to the status of virtual worlds. I want to say that, when you're in a virtual world, you're interacting with real objects. They may be digital objects, to be sure, but they're there. What happens in virtual reality really happens. Maybe just even take a virtual world like, say, Second Life, that people have actually. It peaked around 2007, but it's still going strong, and there are people who build communities in Second Life and build relationships. There are people who work there and sell things there and so on. I think this is now. I mean, maybe video games are to some extent escapism. They involve role-playing fictions, but I think by the time you get to community building in a virtual world, everything happening there is real. It's digital, but it's still real, and what's happening there can have really serious meaning for you. People have built deep and serious relationships in virtual worlds. People have built communities. They've got projects. I think ultimately the virtual world could end up being continuous with the physical world in the kind of meaning it has to us.
When you say that virtual worlds are real and authentic, to what extent is that just a semantic argument or an expansion of the definition of what real means? Right? I mean, there's certainly some people who might say, well, they may be real to you, Dave, but they're not real to me.
I guess I'd want to say that they're basically on a par in most important ways with the physical world. You look at the physical world, okay, it's made up of a bunch of atoms. They're not particularly intrinsically meaningful in themselves, but they add up to very important things that we can interact with, that we can invest with meaning ourselves as conscious creatures in the physical world. I think everything that we do with the physical world, we can do in principle with a digital world. Maybe the digital world is ultimately made of bits. Bits are not any more or less meaningful than atoms, but once these bits get arranged into the right kinds of structures, then we can likewise invest them with meaning and reality the same way we do with the physical world. So I guess I'd want to say the two are continuous. I mean, maybe there's one asymmetry, which is that the physical world was there first, and virtual worlds get constructed within the physical world. But I don't think that makes virtual worlds unreal. I mean, just say God is in heaven and constructs the physical world. The mere fact that it was created doesn't make it unreal. So I mean, I guess I want to think in the senses that matter. It just makes sense to think of virtual worlds as real. But there's a great line in the movie Free Guy that came out last year, which centers on the experiences of non-player characters in a video game. And one of them says, "Does that mean none of this is real?" And the other one says, "Look, I'm sitting here talking to my best friend, trying to help him get through a tough time. If that's not real, I don't know what is." So your reality kind of comes from the relationships we're having are real, the communities are real. I say, that means that what's going on in these worlds should be recognized as real.
Well, and that gets to that quote gets to the heart of this of what strikes me as the most critical element for meaningful experiences in whatever reality you're in, which is the existence of other people. And that of course is we can't be 100% certain of, you might say, as a philosopher, right? But we're all very hopeful that other people do genuinely exist and have authentic experiences. But if we are, this has been my experience with my children and their video game playing, which is obviously very controversial for parents. People are very concerned about the time kids spend playing games. For me, there's a huge distinction between playing games with a half dozen friends and having an immersive, interactive social experience with laughter and joking and leading and following and strategizing and collective thinking. That strikes me as a very rich experience. And again, measured in squeals of delight, it's among the most powerfully positive experiences they have. So that feels like a pretty important piece of the equation.
Yeah, so this is actual social virtual reality. I mean, there's probably a role for non-social virtual reality. I mean, we do have plenty of meaningful experiences that don't involve other people, whether it's reading or thinking or walking or whatever. But so much of what gives meaning to our lives is social. It is in interactions with other people, and it turns out virtual reality is actually pretty good at the social, because it's actually other human beings. You can use VR by yourself, but a lot of VR has now been set up for people to use together. And obviously, video games started off as single player, but they rapidly became multiplayer, and these massive multiplayer online worlds became so crucial. And now there are so many, all the biggest video game platforms are largely social. So I think what we're finding is that these digital worlds serve as really very good locuses for social interaction. It's true that right now most of them are in the game format. I'm very curious to see whether VR technology will produce more worlds like, say, Second Life. Second Life wasn't really a video game. It's just a place where people would go into and set up communities and build relationships and so on without there being any game-like outcome. I guess in many video games for kids these days, the video game is kind of there as a ulterior purpose to get them in there. But once they're there, it's all about the socializing, the interaction. Is that how you find it with your kids?
Yes. Now all they want to do is social gaming. I think it's really in the last decade become the dominant activity of at least boys in our part of the world. So,
interesting.
But it's let's make the case, you and I, that because I'm very intrigued by this assertion that maybe living in virtual worlds will be an even better experience than reality as we experience it now. Now, there are obviously going to be a lot of people listening who think that's preposterous and who find it haunting. And I have some good friends who are, digital entrepreneurs who wear defend IRL in real life T-shirts, and there's I think we're likely to see an equal and opposite force, maybe not equal, but an opposite force pushing back against this kind of movement into virtual experiences. But to make the case that this could be more powerful or as good, if not better, what I would say, and I'm sure you'll build on this, is that if you look at the experiences that we seek out when we do things like go to the movie theater, for instance, and the choices that we make in our lives, we want diversity of experiences, we want freedom, and we want adrenaline, ideally without risk of death.
Mm-hmm.
So when, if you look at the most popular movies that people go to watch, and watching a movie, you don't have agency, but it's a pretty immersive experience in the theater. Pretty consistently, people are choosing to have experiences in a couple hours that give them a virtual experience of, romantic intrigue, adrenaline, near-death experiences. You're clutching the sides of your chair, and then the credits roll, and you can relax, and you didn't actually break your legs when the protagonist jumped out of the third floor of the building. So it feels to me like we humans fundamentally want high adrenaline, high risk experiences that are also social and powerful, but we prefer to do it without actually risking our lives. And this is precisely what I think virtual reality may make possible.
Yeah, so I think this is at the very least one important element of what it makes possible here. I mean, when we go to movies, that's kind of a certain kind of escapism, right? It's not exactly continuous with our ordinary lives, but these are amazing experiences we have, I guess, primarily as a form of entertainment. And I think, VR as a form of entertainment, that's a really major use case for it. Yeah, take what you get at a movie, but make it immersive and interactive, and it's going to be all the more intense. I mean, somebody might object that entertainment is just one small part of our lives. Not about you, but my ordinary life. I'm not the high adrenaline thing only happens from time to time.
Yeah.
But there's also all the small stuff too, like relationships,
Sure.
family, work, colleagues, all those interactions that projects that add up to giving life meaning. But I think all that too can also be done inside virtual reality.
Yes.
That's not the realm of physical reality. I guess I don't want to say straightforwardly virtual reality is going to be better than physical reality.
Okay.
What I'd prefer to say is that maybe there are going to be upsides and downsides for both. There are going to be some things that VR can do for you, which are better than what physical reality can do for you in those respects. Maybe you'll be able to fly in virtual reality. Okay, whole new experiences. Maybe you'll be able to, to sit around in a room with relatives who are on the other side of the world, which you couldn't do without some kind of digital technology. Maybe you'll get to, experiment with having a new body, which would be, experiment with new forms of identity, which would be much harder to do in physical reality. At the same time, physical reality has some advantages too. If you like being in nature, well, physical reality is going to do that for you better than virtual reality, which is human-made by definition. If you appreciate, the body, at least in any near-term future, the pleasures of the flesh in virtual reality are not going to match up to those in physical reality. Maybe that could eventually change with enough brain-computer interfaces and so on. But that's very long-term. So I guess what I want to say is there are basically upsides and downsides of both. But in principle, both give you room for the full range of the human condition. From it's not saying that VR is going to necessarily be wonderful, but it'll give you the full range from the wonderful to the awful, just as you can get in physical reality.
Yeah. And we've learned a lot in recent decades about how nature makes us happier, and how so many of the that even just the progress that we've made in the last few centuries with climate control and any number of other conveniences may be depriving us of some of the richness of the lives that we evolved to experience. On the other hand, one can imagine there are probably certain characteristics of the natural world that we're attracted to. That when you think of movies like Avatar, for instance, which sort of renders a kind of variation on a natural world and a kind of hunter-gatherer immersive experience. I think one of the reasons that movie may have been as compelling for so many people as it was, is that it did speak to these kinds of primordial attractions that we have to a natural environment, a variation on a natural environment. My heart is both with the Defend IRL team and with the hey, let's take off and fly through these new virtual world side. It's hard not to be.
I love physical reality. I'm not saying we should abandon physical reality. It's so important. It's amazing. It's wonderful. Even if you're in a virtual reality, physical reality is going to be what that virtual world is somehow grounded in. But at the same time, I think it's possible to over-romanticize it. I mean, how much time do all of us actually spend in nature? I don't know about you, but I mean, I spend more than half my life inside.
Sure.
Indoors.
Sure.
I think most people do.
Much more than half. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, maybe 2 or 3 hours a day outdoors if we're lucky. And that doesn't make our life meaningless. It's like, boy, despite living our lives indoors, we're managing to have meaningful experiences, bringing out that, so much of it is tied to things like, relationships, community, and so on, of a kind that we can have even when we're not directly in contact with nature. So at the very least, that level of meaning, I think, ought to be possible in VR.
But if you described our lives today, living in glass boxes, getting in glass cars, going to glass shopping malls, spending most of our time indoors, to our hunter-gatherer ancestors, they might have been horrified and thought, well, that's an impoverished existence, right? And today, when you posit in your book that, hey, we are likely to spend an increasing amount of time in virtual worlds. These will be authentic experiences, and they will be largely good experiences. And people have this response: well, that's impoverished. That's an impoverished existence. That's terrifying. Do you think, to some degree, this is a familiarity bias, that we prefer what we're accustomed to, and it's just very hard to think ahead to what the advantages of these future worlds will be, which no doubt will also be offset by some disadvantages.
I do think that's a big factor in how we think about this. We tend to be pretty conservative about how we want our lives to be, but then if you go back, say, 200 years, let alone 2,000 years, and say, look at this life 2,000 years in the future, many people are going to say, "Oh my God, that's dystopian. They've lost contact with the real world, and now they're just living in these constructed environments." But actually, we know from being here that living in a constructed environment, like, say, New York City, hey, well, it's not so bad. Maybe it's artificial, but it's brought with it new forms of meaning and interaction that enabled new forms of community. So I think it is a little bit hard for us to think ahead in that respect. It's also worth saying that, again, none of this has to mean abandoning physical reality. At least for the next, say, 100 years or so, virtual reality is just going to be part of one's life. So maybe you'll spend some hours a day, maybe half your time in physical reality, half your time in virtual environments. Just as we work, we play, we socialize, we're with our families in different environments. So insofar as VR is just part of the equation, then you can also satisfy your itch for being in nature and in physical reality, while also having the virtual part. And again, I don't think that the virtual part has to be less meaningful than the non-virtual part.
Well, and when you talk about dystopian scenarios, there are a couple that come to mind right now. One is that if people start spending a majority of their time in virtual worlds, there's the concern, this has been expressed in movies and science fiction, that we will basically no longer invest in protecting our actual physical world, right? And put our resources into virtual worlds, which could exacerbate the problems we already have with the environment. The other dystopian scenario is that if these virtual worlds are owned by private companies, that all of a sudden, and we see this, obviously. Facebook just renamed the company, as you pointed out, Meta, which is quite remarkable. And Facebook has a bit of a trust problem with many customers, which may be an issue for them. But the fact that most of the biggest tech companies in the world see this as central to their go-forward strategy suggests that we may be pressing up against questions of commercialism. And we already deal with commercialism in our environment, right? Billboards and so on. But if the commercial elements of the environment that we inhabit is present in the very pixels of our vision, that's potentially kind of dystopian.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of potential dystopian. Yeah, there's a lot of potential for dystopia in VR, just as there's lots of potential for utopia. There are amazing ways that societies could develop and experiences it could enable, but there are a lot of ways in which it could go wrong. I guess I worry less about the first part, neglecting physical reality. I just think, boy, it's true we've displayed all kinds of irrationality about maintaining physical reality already, but I don't really think that it's this has been a product of, look at all these other places that we have to hang out in. It would certainly be totally crazy to invest in virtual reality to the point of massively neglecting physical reality. And I'd hope that at some point we'll have the collective rationality to think about more than one thing at a time, develop virtual reality, but also work hard on protecting and developing physical reality. But the corporate side of this is, I think there is a really principled worry there, which, virtual worlds have to be developed by someone. They're kind of artificial by their nature, and whoever develops them has an enormous amount of power. And at least for now, most virtual worlds are, or at least they're built on platforms which are controlled by corporations, whether it's a video game corporation or I think as these social virtual worlds develop, certainly it's obviously Meta wants to be in control of some part of this process. They named their whole company after the metaverse, and the metaverse comes from a science fiction novel by Neil Stephenson, Snow Crash, where the metaverse was a paradigmatic social virtual world that people would go to do just about anything. And yeah, whoever controls a virtual world is in a way like the god of such a world. They created it. They're extremely powerful with respect to that world. They're all-knowing in principle. And obviously, once you've got the tech companies in this role as gods of the virtual worlds, that just brings so many potential dangers. If you think privacy and manipulation are big issues in social media right now, wait till that applies to the whole virtual worlds that we're inhabiting. It's as if corporations didn't just control little local aspects of our lives, but would control the whole environment around us. So I do think there's a lot of dystopian potential there, especially with respect to manipulation, monetization. Maybe in principle we could lose our autonomy if we don't have enough control over our environment and over our actions. So I very much hope there are going to be ways to develop virtual worlds where they're not just controlled by corporations for the purposes of monetization, but maybe they're open metaverse. There's this open metaverse model that could be controlled by users, governed by users, where maybe people could choose the kind of world with the kind of society they want to actually inhabit. So I hope in the long run there's going to be a very rich diversity of virtual worlds for people to choose between. But I don't know. You could certainly spin a dystopian scenario where 2 or 3 corporations control everything, and it's very hard for any other model to get a hold.
Yeah, well, it arguably increases the importance of coming up with new forms of organizations. People are talking a lot now about decentralized autonomous organizations, running on the blockchain, but building systems that are more user controlled, where we collectively control our environments, and actually thinking through these future scenarios, I think is a very useful and important process. You talk in the book about different possible virtual worlds. We probably have options of different kind of worlds to visit. And you mentioned a scenario where NASA might make available a virtual world where you can fly through space, or get in spaceships and explore like a highly accurate simulation of the galaxy. One can imagine like museums or nonprofits building metaverses dedicated to art, to artistic expression, or what have you.
Yeah, I think the sky is the limit for virtual worlds. We already have so many. We already have a vast range of virtual worlds now. You open up like the Oculus Quest and the App Store, and it will take you to. You can already go for a trip through the solar system or through the human brain. But for now, I think mostly we tend to be basing virtual worlds on the physical world to some extent. But I think as things go along, I think we may start questioning that assumption. Why do our virtual worlds need to resemble the physical world? Maybe we'll have worlds with wholly different laws of nature. There's already like anti-gravity worlds we can go into, and you're kind of flying around with no gravitational forces. But yeah, maybe we'll actually be able to use virtual worlds to construct wholly new forms of reality. And as you mentioned before, the brain is very plastic. It can cope with many different things. So I don't know if we construct a 5-dimensional world, if the brain will be able to handle that. But I think there's the possibility of, exploring really very new and different forms of reality.
So interesting. Well, I think we may be ready to take a step further in the direction of outlandish and head spinning, which is to address the simulation hypothesis, the possibility that we may all be living in a simulation right now. Can you walk us through that argument?
Yeah, in a way, this kind of grows out of what we've been talking about, oncoming virtual world and virtual reality technology. Right now, virtual reality technology is fairly primitive. So if you put on a VR headset, you know you're in a virtual world. It's a bit cartoonish. There's many giveaway signs of being in a virtual world. But as the technology gets better and better, these virtual worlds are going to get more photorealistic, more convincing, and in many ways. And it'll eventually get to the point where virtual realities are indistinguishable from physical realities, where you could put someone in to a virtual world and they may not know whether they're in a virtual world or in a physical world. And once we have that technology, of course, that's just going to immediately raise the question, how do we know that's not happening to us? Could it be that we are right now in a virtual world? Could it be, just to make the case more extreme, could it be that our whole lives we've been in a virtual world? And that's basically the scenario made familiar by movies like The Matrix, where Neo wakes up in the beginning of the movie, apparently in a normal physical world, but then comes to discover that all this is in fact a giant computer simulation, a virtual reality, if you like. And that just raises one of the deepest questions in philosophy. How do we know anything about the nature of the world that we live in? Is the world around us, some people put this by saying, is the world around us real or is it a simulation? I would put it by saying, is the world around us physical or is it virtual? Can we ever know that for sure? And there's this thing, the simulation hypothesis is just the hypothesis that we are in fact living in a computer simulated world right from the start, that was set up by a simulator in the next universe up. Just as we can create simulations within our world, maybe someone else created a simulation which is our world, and that's the world we're living in.
And the kind of logical argument, excuse me, I'll say that again. And the logical argument making the case that there's a high probability that we're living in a simulation, which I think Elon Musk at one point famously kind of tossed out in a conference, was put forward by Nick Bostrom, and I think you had written a paper right around the same time along similar lines. And let me know if I'm saying this correctly, but I understand the hypothesis to be, computers are getting more and more powerful. If the pace of the increasing power of computers continues, at some point, whether it's 50 years, 100 years, 200 years from now, it will be possible to spin up universes in full fidelity, running on these systems, and it's hard to imagine that our future progeny would not be curious enough, if they have the capacity, to spin up worlds in which consciousness emerges. Right, and full universes. It's hard to imagine that they wouldn't choose to do so. And if that's the case, and if they do have this capacity, they're likely to spin up, millions of these worlds. And if they do so, the probability that we are not living in a simulation, opposed to living in the original world, is only 1 in a million. Let's say in that scenario. Of course, a contrarian scenario is that the world ceases to exist, that we wipe ourselves out as a species, and then we would not be living in a simulation if 25 years from now there's an apocalyptic event. In the absence of apocalypse, it's more likely that we'd be living in a simulation. I think that you've landed at, I believe, a 25%. An estimate that there's a 25% probability that we are in fact living in a simulation. Is that right? Do you want to? Why would your estimate be 25% probability opposed to 99%?
Yeah, so I think Elon Musk was following an early version of the argument put forward by Hans Moravec, the roboticist and futurist, who said, basically it's overwhelmingly likely that we're in a simulation because many, many simulations are going to be developed in the history of the universe, way more simulated beings than unsimulated beings. Therefore, what are the odds I'm one of the unsimulated ones? Maybe 1,000 to 1 against, if there are 1,000 times more simulated beings. There's a more more sophisticated version developed maybe 10 years later by Nick Bostrom, which he calls the simulation argument, where he doesn't argue directly for we're probably in a simulation. Instead, he argues either we're probably in a simulation, or for some reason, simulations won't be created. And then he says, well, if simulations aren't created, that's going to be for one of the reasons you said. Maybe we'll destroy ourselves first, or maybe we'll have the ability to make these simulations, but we'll choose not to, maybe because we think they're too dangerous or they're too unethical, so we won't create them. So Bostrom's argued for a three-way conclusion. Either we're probably in a simulation, or most civilizations will go extinct, or they won't create simulations. So I think he ended up maybe around 33%.
Okay.
I end up organizing things just a little bit differently. I think one other very important way the argument could go wrong is if it turns out that you can't have consciousness in a simulation. Many people are, this is a very deep and controversial question, whether a fully digital system could be conscious in the way that biological humans are. And actually, my day job is to think about consciousness and its relationship to brains and machines. And personally, I'm inclined to find it plausible that there could be a consciousness in a digital system, in a simulation. But if there's not, as many people think, then we can rule out the simulation hypothesis, because hey, we know we're conscious.
Right.
If a simulation can't be conscious, we can't be in a simulation. So I end up so the way I end up doing things is roughly breaking it down. How could this argument go wrong? First, it could be impossible to have conscious human-like beings like us in a simulation. Second, it could be possible to do it, but people won't end up creating them. And then I say, okay, but as long as both those conditions are satisfied, as long as they're possible and people end up creating them, then most beings will be simulated. And then I say, okay, how probable is each of those claims? How probable is it that conscious human-like simulations of us are even possible? I say, well, at least 50%. Mm-hmm. How probable is it that if they're possible, enough civilizations will create them that most beings are simulations? I say, yeah, at least 50% for that. Put those two together, multiply them out, you get a 25% probability that most beings like us are simulated. And then just by the original chain of reasoning, you get, okay, that looks like it's about a 25% chance, at least a 25% chance that we are ourselves in a simulation. So that's how I get there. You shouldn't take the numbers too seriously, but I do think this is some reason for taking the possibility seriously.
Well, I'm glad you didn't have the probability of an apocalypse as one of your criteria. That's optimistic. You think we're going to make it for hundreds of years to come?
I built that into the 50. I said 50% for if these simulations are possible, we'll build them. Then there's a 50% chance that we won't build them, and
I see. Okay.
Some portion of that maybe covers a 10% probability for apocalypse.
Okay.
I don't know. Maybe 10% is too optimistic.
I was thinking to myself that 10% probability of apocalypse is alarming, but yes, but both may be true. So we had Antonio Damasio on the show, who I'm sure you're familiar with his work, the neuroscientist, and who's just wonderful. And this question of substrate dependence has been of great interest to me. Meaning, is it possible, to generate to have consciousness emerge on, say, silicon chips? Is there something about the nature of biology, of human biology, of the biology of our natural world, that is unique and cannot be replicated, let's say, on silicon chips? And that's, Damasio has this view that central to the emergence of consciousness, that what preceded the emergence of consciousness was feelings, and feelings required physical vulnerability, right? And so this sort of physical vulnerability of multi-celled organisms, created a pain response, which eventually manifested in a whole kind of symphony of feelings, and then layered on top of that is consciousness, so that there was arguably a substrate dependence. Having said that, Damasio was also working on creating feelings type systems on a silicon, for computer-based intelligence. So I've come around to the idea that maybe consciousness is not substrate dependent, but this is one of the questions that potentially would prevent full emergence of consciousness in simulations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, Antonio Damasio and I had a debate about this about maybe 4 or 5 years ago in New York City. It's just come out in a book of debates called Great Minds Don't Think Alike.
Oh, wonderful.
And yeah, one of the topics that we were arguing about was, to what extent is biology essential for consciousness? And my understanding of Antonio's position is that he does think at some level you've got to have something like human biology for consciousness, whereas my line is the biology is not essential. What's essential rather is the way that everything is hooked up to everything else and the patterns of information processing and so on. So one way this comes out is via a thought experiment where we gradually replace the neurons in the human brain by silicon chips, say, so that first just replace 5% of the brain, 10% of the brain, but eventually 50%, and eventually end up with a silicon brain that functions just like the original human brain. And then the question is, will it be conscious, or will consciousness disappear somewhere along the way in that process? And I've always argued that if there's consciousness at the beginning, there'll be consciousness at the end. There's nothing absolutely special about biology. And the alternative is a kind of bio-chauvinism, where the biology somehow has magic powers. I've never quite seen how and why it would be that biology would have powers here that, say, silicon would not. But I think, at least at that point, Antonio was going the other way, although you say now he's trying to simulate feelings on a chip.
Yes, he's working with a student on that as a project, which is interesting. I don't know, his view may have evolved. On the subject of the evolution of views, Dave, you are most famous, perhaps, for having posited the hard problem of consciousness, right? Which effectively stated that the emergence of an experience of what it is like to be conscious, it is a kind of miraculous development that's very hard to wrap your head around or to explain. And it seems the way that you're now speaking of sort of substrate independence of consciousness, that your view of this problem may have softened over the years. Is that the case, or you feel this is a different question?
I don't know if it's changed that much. Yeah, I mean, there is this basic phenomenon of consciousness that stares us all in the face. We are conscious beings. That is, we have the subjective experience of perception, of feeling, of action. There's something it's like to be us. And this is a very deeply mysterious fact. How is it that a physical system like a brain should have subjective experience? Why does hooking up 86 billion neurons in the right patterns somehow give you the experience of consciousness? So that's what I call the hard problem of consciousness. How is it that how and why is it that physical processes in the brain should give you a conscious experience at all? Why is there consciousness in the world? But at the same time, I don't see why there's a difference between, say, biology and silicon processes here. I think the hard problem arises equally for both. Yeah, it would be very mysterious and surprising that silicon processes could give you consciousness, but it's also very mysterious and surprising that biological processes give you consciousness. I don't see any special reason why the biology should be crucial. And I guess over the years, it's come to seem to me that consciousness is most directly tied not to the specific substrate, but to patterns of information processing. So when you get information processed in a certain way, then you get consciousness like that. I mean, we still have the hard problem of why that happens. Nobody understands that. So to that extent, we should all have some humility here. But if it is the information processing that matters, then to me, it doesn't make a essential difference whether that happens in biology, in silicon, or in some other substrate.
This notion that we may be living in a simulation is kind of horrifying to a lot of people, right? Somehow less so to kids. I remember I remember sharing this with my 14-year-old son. This argument in like 3 sentences that we might be living in a simulation, and he said, "Oh yes, of course, that makes perfect sense." Because they spend time in these very compelling virtual worlds that are computer games. It made rational sense to him, but I imagine that you would say to a typical listener right now who's thinking, "Gosh, if we are living in a simulation that's been spun up on the computer of some teenager living in his mother's basement in 200 years, this would really just drain all the meaning out of my life." And my guess is that the extension of your argument that virtual worlds are authentic and real and places where we can live meaningful and purposeful lives, that this extends to the simulation scenario.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I guess, why is it so horrifying that we're in a simulation? Maybe because you think that if we're in a simulation, none of this is real. But yeah, I think that's the wrong way to think about it. If we're in a simulation, and we might be, there's still people, there's still chairs, tables, there's still trees, there's still buildings, there's still communities. That's all digital at some level, but that doesn't make it any less real. Maybe what horrifies some people is the idea of the simulator, this being who created our world and will have massive power over it and might destroy it at any time. But I don't see why that's any different in principle from, say, the hypothesis that there's a God. A God who created our world and has power over it. Yeah, God has the power to potentially to interfere with our lives and destroy our lives at any time. But most people who believe in a God don't take this as reason to think it's all meaningless or horrible. So yeah, let's just turn God into a simulator. Why is that suddenly so much worse? Especially if the simulator is kind of mostly running a hands-off simulation. Mm-hmm. They got things started at the beginning, and now the whole thing is off and running, and the simulator isn't interfering. Then I think that's an interesting hypothesis about how our world works. It doesn't mean that nothing here is real. It means that underlying all this was the act of some computer processes created by a simulator. But I think none of that is reason to be horrified. We can go on with what gives our lives meaning is not, I think, how the world was created or how it's run, but things like the relationships that we have, the communities that we're a part of, the experiences that we have. And I think we can get that meaning in principle just as well in a simulated world as in an unsimulated world.
Yes, I think that makes sense. I do think, though, that the notion that this might have been, that our entire reality may have been a kind of whimsical execution, by again,
it makes us feel kind of trivial somehow.
Well, by one of potentially thousands or even millions of whimsical sort of worlds generated. Again, I visualize like a teenager in a basement in 300 years. There's a potential callousness to it that are concerning. But this question:
how did you feel? How did you feel about us being just on the one tiny location in an outer arm of the galaxy, in a giant cosmos that may have millions of populations? That may make us kind of trivial and insignificant as well. Is the simulation different from that?
Well, I would say that this beautiful process of discovering our universe and all the possibilities it presents has been a long history of greater and greater humility.
It's true.
We've gone from
at one point we were at the center.
We were at the very center, and then we were sort of somewhere in the outskirts, and now we're one of millions of galaxies. And this is actually part of. I think it is accurate to say that the notion that we're living in a simulation is no more kind of discomforting or draining of meaning than what's the best guesses that physicists are starting to have about what our actual reality is. Like, if you believe that the universe is mechanistic, it is effectively a giant computer, right? In the absence of a belief in spirits and gods and so on, the universe itself is a giant computer, which to me, generates another interesting question, which is, if the universe is a large mechanistic computer, within which, I mean, speaking metaphorically, within which life has emerged and our consciousness has emerged, the hypothesis here is that we will design within the universe that is a computer more efficient computers that can spin up large volumes of high resolution universes, right? So somehow there has to be a large increase in efficiency of the mechanics, right? Of universe evolution, of universe generation, in order for that to be possible.
Yeah, or else the universes that do the creation have much more capacity than the universes they create. I mean, it could be that like the grand, all-encompassing base reality is infinite, with infinite resources, and in the infinite universe, it'll be fairly trivial to create even very large finite universes. They may have infinite energy to power them and so on. What will be much harder to do is for a universe to create a simulation of itself, especially for a finite universe.
Yeah.
Then if you've only got like a Google bits of information, then in your universe, then it's awfully hard to simulate that Google bits of information and still have anything left over for the rest of the universe. So it does look like there's reasons to believe in a kind of a chain of complexity going down where we gradually simulate simpler universes. But as you say, there could be kinds of efficiency here. So for example, one thing that simulators might choose to do is only simulate part of the universe. Maybe our simulators will simulate the solar system or the Earth, and then leave the rest just on a very simple background simulation for, a few bits of information for the stars and so on, but not try and really simulate that in anything like the same detail. So that does give rise to the possibility that we could be living in a kind of a much more local simulation than we thought, where maybe the solar system is real, but the rest of it is not. I mean, maybe that would explain some things, like why we haven't found any extraterrestrial life so far. It's because we're just living in this local simulation where they only bothered to simulate intelligence in this solar system.
Right. It was going to be too expensive in terms of processing power to generate a bunch of other extraterrestrials. No, I think this question of who the simulators would be and what their motivations are is so interesting. One scenario you threw out is that historians may want to analyze other historical scenarios through simulation generation. So, for instance, what might have happened if Hillary Clinton lost to Donald Trump?
Right.
Right. Well, perhaps that we're living in the simulation that was generated in order to play out that experiment.
Yeah, let's tweak the parameters and see what happens. Let's throw in a vote on Britain leaving the European Union. Maybe Russia is going to invade Ukraine. Let's put in the parameters for a pandemic. Let's see what goes in all these different different scenarios. And yeah, we may just be in the middle of one of those historical simulations for all we know.
Well, and you say that simulators may be particularly interested in sims who suspect that they are living in a simulation, which means you, David Chalmers, are much more likely to be simulated than my mother, who is not at all concerned that we're living in a simulation. or maybe the simulators are more likely to keep you around.
Any listener listening to this right now, this is maybe some sign that you're in a. Is it just coincidence you happen to find yourself listening to this podcast about a simulation right now? It's much more likely. Maybe the simulators are really interested in trying to figure out whether humanity will figure out that we're in a simulation. So it's constantly simulating people going through this process. So yeah, just listening to this podcast has made it more likely that you're in a simulation.
Well, and
if that worries you, think about what it means for me, who just spent 5 years writing a book about it.
Well, then there's the concern that if you find decisive evidence that we are simulated, they might delete you because it might make the experiment less interesting, right? If I like the argument that we need to live really interesting lives to avoid being deleted.
The philosopher Hegel said that the point of the universe is to become conscious of its own nature. And once the universe becomes conscious of its own nature, then that's the end of history. So the simulation version of this is like, the simulators set up the universe in order to see when we would actually realize that we're in a simulation. The moment we realize that, at that point, the universe is conscious of its own nature. And at that point, that's the end of history. So maybe at that point, they shut down the simulation, or maybe they upload us from the simulation to the next stage of history.
Interesting. Well, I'm hopeful that when people hypothesize that if they're trying to save on computer power, they might just sort of delete less interesting sims.
Even if they run us really slowly, that'd be okay. Simulators, if you're out there, please upload all of us so we get some life after death. You can put us on a slow computer; it's all right. We'll still get to experience it.
The old jalopy in the corner. Well, but it seems more probable that much in the way that we have so much memory on our phones that we don't bother deleting poor photographs or emails. That our simulators might not bother deleting us because there's plenty of storage capacity.
Okay.
That's
good backups. Good backups, please, and reactivate us every now and then, so we're not just sitting there statically in backup storage, but we actually get to have some things happen to us every now and then.
When we think about motivations for simulators, the ability to inhabit a range of, presumably a simulator could sort of tap into the on-the-ground experience of individual sims. And so, the ability to actually inhabit a range of people's full experiences could be quite interesting. Like, imagine a movie in which you actually are each character in succession that's in the movie. I've always loved the Jean Genet quote, "I do not take lightly the idea that other people make love without me." Which is, Jean Genet had so much curiosity and appetite that he actually wanted to be a participant in every lovemaking throughout the universe. That's quite an aspiration.
Who has a right to be conscious without me being there? That's It's kind of, I don't know if it's a solipsistic thought or a megalomaniac thought.
Yeah,
my consciousness should be running the cosmos. It's a bit like that. Being John Malkovich, I guess we all had access to John Malkovich's consciousness. We could go inside and inhabit his experience. So I guess one reason for the simulator to build a simulation is to be able to try and access any number of different kinds of experiences in that John Malkovich way. Maybe we'd also need not just amazing virtual reality technology, but amazing empathy technology, so we can take someone else's brain or some simulation and get our own brain, our own experience to transform so that it mirrors someone else's experience. But people already talk about virtual reality as an empathy machine. You get to put yourself in the shoes of other people quite regularly, maybe just by putting yourself in a body and an environment like theirs. But the extreme version of the empathy machine is to actually put yourself inside their consciousness. And that technology may come eventually.
Well, one thing that strikes me is that as a philosopher and as somebody who's just curious about these topics, as I am, that it's easy and fun to go through this kind of thought experiment. To run thought experiments. Like let's run. What if this were true, and what if that were true, and that's precisely what one does as a philosopher, right, over the period of many years. But for your average person listening, this can seem like, maybe amusing and fun for some people, but for others, really disconcerting. and I remember a few years ago, I shared this simulation hypothesis with my brother, who's a biologist working to save the planet. And his immediate response was, how could someone meeting future simulators be so cruel as to create all that pain and suffering? His immediate reaction was that it was morally objectionable, which is, I guess, one of the scenarios in which there would not be simulations, right? Is if there was a conclusion in the future that it was in fact immoral spin up universes. The counter argument would be that if you believe in biodiversity, which my brother does, which was my counter argument to him, that creating more diverse realities is a moral positive. If you think that biodiversity is good.
Yeah, I mean, it's true that it's very tempting to get into kind of science fiction mode when you think about these scenarios. So to think about them playfully as thought experiments, which is I guess the mode I often tend to slip into when thinking about this. But then you think, well, what if this is real? And actually, this is the place where, the oncoming technology of virtual reality is saying all this is actually, to some extent, becoming real. So we say we can speculate about the ethics of the simulators in this kind of science fiction mode. Well, I hope they're being ethical. But actually, in the future, we're going to be faced with these choices ourselves. I mean, for now, maybe when we make a virtual reality, it doesn't create conscious beings, so the ethics are somewhat more limited. But we already talked about the tech companies creating virtual worlds that many people are in, and we very much hope they're going to think ethically about that. They're going to be strong. There's going to be a need for strong ethics, strong regulations there. And then we get to the future where we might be creating simulations that contain artificial intelligences that have the capacity to suffer, to be happy, to experience the range of experiences that we have. And at that point, the ethics become just terrifying. I mean, it's like we have the power to. Do we really want to give people or even corporations the power to play God and create whole civilizations just like that, or should that just be a power that is either restricted to some very few, very limited range of scenarios or actors, or maybe banned entirely? We're going to have a lot of these philosophical discussions at this point. Like, for example, is it okay to create a world with some suffering as long as there's a lot more happiness? Or is creating any suffering going to be sort of in itself a bad thing? These are going to be very difficult questions for the regulators of the future to come up against.
Yes, particularly if you believe that happiness requires some suffering, right? I mean, that the two are attached, right? So that it becomes complicated. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
But does the happiness we have require, say, the suffering that went into, I don't know, the Holocaust?
Right. Correct.
Maybe they could have gotten away with less suffering than that.
Absolutely. Well, and one can imagine some kind of policies or codes that would require some kind of braking mechanism just to prevent suffering, right? I mean, I think the weirdness, the weirdness of all these hypotheticals, along with, I would argue, the disorienting speed of just technological advancement in general that everybody's experiencing, and the bizarreness of the direction of physics and science these days, it feels to me like there is arguably a kind of second coming of an existential crisis that perhaps our culture is or will be reckoning with, right? If we think about like existentialism depending on where I don't know if one says that Nietzsche and Kierkegaard were early stage existentialists, or whether you see it coming later with Camus and Sartre, but late 19th, early 20th centuries, I see as responding in part to the collapse of a coherent intellectual argument for the existence of God in the face of the expanding explanatory power of science, right? So we had this, obviously many people believe in God and did that and do today, but for a whole class of intellectuals, there was a perception that this notion of a benevolent God was no longer sustainable given this increasing explanatory power of science, and it resulted in a real kind of collective cultural struggle against absurdity and potential pointlessness of our existence. To me, what we're experiencing today is a whole nother level of that, right? That it's one thing to have in response to that, we rebuilt a kind of secular humanism, right? And a sense that, well, there is meaning and purpose in the absence of a God. We still have a powerful sense of meaning and purpose as humans. Now you take it a step further and say, in recent decades, we had a conversation with Sam Harris about whether or not free will is something that is makes sense in light of what we know of science. We talk about possibilities of infinite universes and living in simulations, and I think for a lot of people, and even people that I talk to and know, I get the feeling that this is actually deeply kind of threatening, and I think this is when philosophers like yourself come forward with important points of view to hold people's hands and say, let's talk through this. It's going to be okay. Our lives still matter.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, there are different challenges thrown up by technology here that can precipitate this kind of existential crisis. I mean, one very serious one is the oncoming artificial intelligence. Once we get to AI systems which are at the level of humans or maybe even greater, then it's like, boy, are we now becoming insignificant in the universe? Is this the next step of evolution? I think that can lead to a serious existential crisis. But there's also the kinds of crises tied to simulation technology and virtual worlds, where, one extreme version of it would be, what if we're in a simulation already? Does that make our lives meaningless? I guess I'd want to, and I think a lot of this does boil down to your philosophical attitude towards these possibilities. A third one is the possibility of uploading our brains so we actually become artificial intelligences. Is that something that we should do? And I think, we're going to have to think philosophically about all of these cases. Could you survive an uploading process? What is the value of life of artificial intelligence? Is life in a virtual reality still a meaningful life? We're actually going to have to figure some of those things out. And I think, you will find philosophical pessimists here who say this is all a route to nihilism. I'm myself more of a philosophical optimist. I think we can find meaning in many different scenarios. So maybe it's just because I'm a glass half full person rather than a glass half empty person. But I'd like to think that these technological developments needn't empty our lives of meaning. Rather, they'll turn into new ways to fill our lives with meaning.
Well, it's an important message, and it's a fascinating topic. I think your book is way ahead of its time, and I think it's possible that people may look back at this book in 100 years as having been prescient. Because there's I don't know how many other people have been thinking this far ahead, but this is that. Can you imagine such a scenario?
That would certainly be a happy outcome for me, at least intellectually. I mean, I've certainly been through this thing in the past with the ideas initially outlandish, like the extended mind idea, coming to seem like second nature and kind of obvious. And I think actually with respect to virtual worlds, this may have been happening for a while. I find that kids are already a lot more open to these ideas than old people like me. They grow up in these digital worlds, and for them, it's like, it's kind of obvious that digital reality is genuine reality. So maybe we're already on a cusp. And there are certainly many people who hear what I'm saying now and they find it totally implausible or even repugnant. But it wouldn't totally surprise me if even in 20 years' time, there's a lot more openness to it. And as for in 100 years' time, they're going to say, well, come on, this was totally obvious all along.
Right. Of course, it's also possible that your book was a plant by our simulators running an experiment to see how it would impact what kind of perception it would get.
There's probably a whole lot of different simulations running with different books focusing in different places, and then now they're doing the market research, I don't know, to figure out exactly how to set up the simulations of the future.
Indeed. Well, David Chalmers, thank you for taking time out of your philosophizing and hanging out in virtual reality and singing with your band, the Zombie Blues, to be with us today. It was such an interesting conversation.
Thanks, Rufus. This was a pleasure. Great to talk to you about these things.
And Well, Dave, maybe we'll have to play some Oculus mini golf. I've got to check that out. That sounds pretty cool.
Sure. Yeah, they got some nice settings by the beach or wherever. And table tennis. I think I tried the table tennis once. That was kind of cool.
Super cool. Yeah. Well, maybe our next podcast interview will be in a virtual space. We'll
sure. Yeah, I love doing this kind of thing.
We'll have avatars
in virtual spaces. I'd be up for that anytime. Yeah, I've done a few like interviews and so on in virtual spaces. Let's see, there were a couple in Alt Space, and none of them were like amazing uses of the space. It was basically get inside a space with avatars and talk. Maybe the most interesting one I did was the Financial Times of London has this feature called Lunch, where they have lunch with somebody, and they asked me about having lunch in VR. And turns out, well, lunch in VR is not that easy to do. But we managed to find a virtual restaurant with some virtual pieces of sushi inside the virtual restaurant. At the same time, we ordered. The journalist was in London. I was in New York, but we each ordered some physical sushi. So we kind of went through this process of having lunch. Went through some of the motions of eating the virtual sushi inside the restaurant, while more or less simultaneously took bites of the physical sushi, and it worked out fairly well.
Yeah, I think we might still be in the augmented reality phase for international sushi eating virtual.
I think that's
lunches.
right. That's right.
So you got to be able to see the sushi. Well, wonderful, David. Well, by the way, we'll in our outro, and of course, we're going to encourage everybody to buy your book, which I think is wonderful, and I've been proselytizing, and really great. I look forward to future conversations.